My father, Mars Dimitrovsky, was born on December 16th, 1923, in Havana, Cuba, and he passed away on April 27, 2012, in Florida. I'm now going to be reading an excerpt of his memoir. My relatives and in-laws that emigrated to various parts of the world were influenced by their surroundings in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. The Russian Tsars allowed Jews to live only in certain parts of Russia known as the Pale. They were not allowed to travel out of the Pale without permission. The Jews were continuously harassed with murderous pogroms throughout Russia, Lithuania, and Russian Poland. The Russians conscripted Jewish boys for 25 years in the army, hoping that at the end of their conscription, they would no longer know what it is to be a Jew. These pressures accounted for the mass migration of Jews before World War I. After the First World War, 4 major world empires fell. They were Russia, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman empires. My relatives and in-laws came to China, America, and Cuba looking for freedom, to start their own businesses, and allowed to own property, have freedom of religion, and to educate their children. All of my relatives came eventually to America or to Australia. The collapse of the 4 empires after World War I caused a new migration from Europe. This caused the United States to begin a series of restrictive immigration policies. As an example of this policy, by about 1924, only about 6,500 Jews were allowed in the United States from Poland per year. The immigration policy tended to prefer English and French in preference to Eastern and Southern Europe. Both sides of my parents' families have roots in Eastern Europe, although nobody is remaining there anymore because they would have left either around the time of the pogroms and Kristallnacht or definitely would have perished in the Holocaust. My mother's parents came as young teenagers independently on steamships across the Atlantic, and when they arrived here with very little money and very little knowledge of the language, or no knowledge at all, they were taken in by some relatives in New York, in the Brooklyn area, and eventually those people recommended that they meet, and they had an arranged marriage, which was continuing the tradition of what would have happened had they stayed in one of the shtetls or small little villages in Eastern Europe. My father's side of the family, many of them ended up fleeing on the Trans-Siberian Railroad to China. And they created an amazing life for themselves in China, where they started a fur business and some trading businesses. And they lived really quite well there and were able to express their religion freely until communist rule came to China. And then the Chinese government decided that the Jews needed to leave. So they started on the move again, and many of them ended up in Australia. Several of them did eventually come to the United States, and my grandparents ended up in Cuba. At the time, Havana was a very welcoming place for the Jews, and my father was born there, and he had a sister who was also born there and passed away there. They lived there for quite some time, alone, eventually sending my father to the United States by himself under this law called the Pedro Plan, where young people were allowed to emigrate as long as they had relatives in the United States. And his grandparents were now living in the United States, so he was able to leave. But my own grandparents stayed in Cuba for many, many years. They did not get visas to come to the United States, and they eventually left Cuba and went back to China for a while. And so it was about 8 to 10 years before my father saw his parents again. And by that time, he himself was a young teenager.